idea 1 of theme 3 states that development is a contested concept which is evolving over time. But what is development? At the most basic level, it is about something changing and getting better. But what exactly is changing? Is it the economic status of a place, social conditions for a population, the access to a political voice, or a move towards a greener way of living? Can all these things happen mutually exclusively of each other? Or is one or more aspect going to suffer at the expense of another? And who gets to decide what actually is an improvement? Are improvements gained in the short term destined to lead to problems in the long term? So, a very complex topic, and one which economists, politicians, environmentalists, and so-called development experts have been grappling with for decades now. In order to be successful at this course, you will need to make up your own mind too, and be able to justify your beliefs. Remember, there is no actual right or wrong answer, but there will be well-structured or poorly structured arguments. Make sure that your points are the former. We need to study a chronological evolution of development theories. This podcast will give you a brief overview to help you structure your thoughts. However, you will need to supplement this with your own wider reading and thinking. The prologue to development theories was in 1919, shortly after the end of World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson announced at the League of Nations that all nations should work to improve the conditions of working people all over the world. The concepts of development or aid were not explicitly mentioned at this time, but it certainly suggested that there was an awareness that societies had a moral and ethical obligation to help those in worse situations than themselves. During the 1930s, the British economist John Keynes suggested that economic development would come about as a result of state intervention and investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. This is what we as geographers know as the multiplier effect today. Keynesian economics underpins many different subsequent development theories. In 1949, a few years after the end of World War II, President Truman called for, as he put it, the first time in history for foreign aid to be given to poor countries. Many would therefore consider this point to be the launch pad for development as a concept. The Marshall Plan, the preceding year, had been a successful model of giving American financial aid to war-torn Europe, and therefore it was believed that this would be an effective way of giving aid to other countries in the future. Additionally, the background of political changes, with the end of colonialism in Africa and the beginnings of the Cold War between the two contrasting ideologies of capitalist USA and Western Europe and communist USSR, meant that the two emerging superpowers were keen to curry favour with as many new African states as possible. Would the provision of economic aid bring political allegiances? During the 1950s and 1960s, therefore, development was very much seen as a way to economic growth. This was encapsulated by the 5-stage model of economic growth, which the American economist and staunch capitalist Walt Rostow created in the 1960s. Encouraging countries to develop their economies in this way, effectively following the lead set by the West, is known as modernization. Modernization can be summarized by the phrases "the West is best" and "helping the rest become like the West." Whilst there are clear strengths to these ideas, do think about the huge financial investments that would be required for top-down development schemes to kickstart economies, and consider the validity of imposing a blatantly Eurocentric approach on very different cultures in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. Clearly, the modernisation approach was not the panacea to closing the development gap, and therefore alternative approaches also appeared. The first of these was the structuralist theory, which suggested that poorer countries should limit their interaction with the global economy in order to allow domestic economic growth. This basically meant that less economically developed countries were encouraged to process more of their own raw materials into higher value manufactured goods, which could then be bought by the local population. This had the effect of reducing the cost of imports and so increased a country's balance of trade. We will be learning later on how Ghana adopted some of these structuralist policies with its focus on developing certain industries and its Feed Ourselves campaign. However, whilst on paper it seemed to be fair to allow developing countries to develop their own import substitution industries, many developed nations, who had got rich by processing cheaply purchased raw materials and selling them back at much higher prices, were not so keen, and in response started to form trade blocs to prevent effective structuralist policies working in the global economy.